G'day, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures. We love the biographical type of interviews, and Dan has produced quite a few over the journey, particularly over the last couple of years with some of the great broadcasters in particular. But now the microscope turns on himself, and this will be very interesting seeing Dan in the interviewee chair. We do this, of course, all thanks to the great support that is provided, obviously, from the major sponsor in KISS Professional Solutions with John McEncroe and the team. Don't forget, they have offices in Carrum Downs, Sydney, Shepparton, Albury, and Gippsland. They service Wagga from their Albury office as well. You can contact them via 1300 KISS PS 5477 and 77 off the back of that via the phone. Dan, how does it feel being in the interviewee chair, first of all?
I don't like it. When I was asked by Joanne, my producer and partner, to why don't you do an interview and it is your podcast and you be interviewed by someone, I'm a bit reluctant. I mean, people would say I love talking about myself, and that might be right, Damo, but I'd prefer to ask the questions than actually have people ask me. I mean, I've been very lucky in my life to have done this. But there's been some challenges as well, and I know that you'll be as gentle to me as you possibly can, but I expect hard questions as well. So, yeah, I'm a bit nervous, but looking forward to it as well. So, hopefully, we can have a decent chat. And people that don't know a great deal about me, I'm writing a book as well, which is at this stage tentatively titled "Who is Dan Lonergan?" Maybe they find out a bit more about me this way too, Damo, but we'll just wait and see.
No, looking forward to it. And I can say from a personal experience, Dan, I reckon you hit your sweet spot. I don't know if you would agree with this necessarily either, but when you feel like you love sport the absolute most, and you try and love sport as much as you can right throughout your life and not get too jaded. But when you're about 9 or 10 years old, that's when you hit the sweet spot, I reckon, because you got that youthful love and amazement and wonder of sport. And it was around that age that I used to listen to you on ABC radio. So you bring back a lot of memories of my youth in particular, not trying to make you feel old in any way, shape, or form, but there's the reverence there that certainly I still hold towards you. So I'm interested to hear about your career and your life. We may as well go back to the beginning because we often go in chronological order with these things.
Good.
Dan, just tell us firstly, because a lot of people might not know about your family background. It's kind of funny because, in a weird way, you were surrounded by probably people towards the back end of their lives because your dad was involved in the funeral industry. Is that right?
Well, not straight away, Damo. He came to Australia as a £10 pom in 1964. For those who don't know what the £10 pom is, it's a scheme organised by Robert Menzies that you come out here and you pay $10. And that's what happened. So he came out here and paid $10 to become part of the immigration scheme. And he settled in Tasmania. And he tried to do medicine, didn't quite work out for him. And then he went to Sydney and he became a medical salesman after being a salesman trying to sell dictionaries for a while. So he became a medical salesman for Santos. And then he got into real estate after he was in SPC in marketing. So he tried a few things. And then the job in the funeral industry as general manager of one of the big ones in Melbourne, John Allison Monkhouse, came up. So it was we were already around. I was 9, Tim was 8, and Stephen was 5. 1978 was he started in the funeral industry, and he continued that for the rest of his life for another 23 years. But you're right. I mean, that was his passion, that was his love, and he then took over a couple of funeral companies in 1986. So he became a small business owner in the funeral industry, and as I say, did love it. Was a very, very good funeral director. Great empathy, Dad, and particularly very good to the Irish community. He always said, any Irish person living in Australia, if they are struggling financially, I will make sure that they have a funeral, that they are looked after. And that was always one of his strengths. And he stood by that up until his dying days, which sadly occurred way too young at the age of 63 in December 2001. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1. 1.
And what about your mother, Dan? I know she's recently passed away. Can you tell us a bit about her and her passions and also her personality?
What a character. From the Whelan family, very big family. They were Irish, but she was born in Australia. She's one of six. She was the first daughter, three sons, then her, then another son, and then a sister who they're very close to each other, 11 and a half years apart, Auntie Helen and Mum. And Whelan the Wrecker, big uh, business in demolition in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, in Brunswick. Mum grew up in Melville Road, Brunswick, and just around the corner in Brunswick and Coburg was the big Will and the Wrecker demolition business. And there were all these cartoons when I was a little kid. Will and the Wrecker was here with all the big cranes demolishing buildings, etc. Unfortunately, the financial collapse in 1990, a pyramid in the State Bank saw Will and the Wrecker go into receivership. Will and Carterway, which my mum's cousin Tony ran for a long time, still exists today, but unfortunately Will and the Wrecker didn't exist. They also owned Rec Air, that one of my uncles, Des, was into as well, which was more about hiring machinery, and then he owned DG Wheel and Rentals. So a lot of the brothers were into that particular side of industry, and it kept them busy for a long, long time. But unfortunately, as I say, 1990, one of the most iconic businesses in Melbourne, particularly in northern Melbourne, went into receivership, and that was pretty tough for the family.
Yeah, no doubt. And we'll discuss some of the obstacles going forward as well. But I always ask about one's parents because often, and it's not always the case. I know in my case, I didn't share the same interests and passions as my parents, but were your parents passionate about sport? And is that where it spawned from for you?
No, Dad wasn't passionate at all, but it was rather ironic, Damien, because in 1985 we didn't have a colour television at home. It must have been the only household that I knew that didn't have a colour television, and we got one. Now my nana, who was still alive, well, wasn't alive then, but was alive till 1981. She was one of the first people, my mum's mum, who got a colour television. So if we wanted to watch colour television, we'd go around the corner to Ivanhoe. We lived in Eaglemont, in the leafy inner north and eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and my nana was in Ivanhoe just around the corner. So we'd go around there and watch colour television. But Dad wanted to watch the FA Cup. He wanted to watch it in colour. So he hired a colour television, even though he wasn't really into sport. But he followed Collingwood because it was the local team. And my mother was an Essendon supporter, much to the chagrin of her brothers who were Carlton supporters and gave her a hard time. She loved her tennis, loved watching Margaret Court as a younger lady back in the 60s, and Rod Laver and Ken Rosewall. And she played tennis, just loved having a hit of tennis with her friends when we were young kids in the 70s. So she was into tennis. She was into her footy. She took us to the cricket. My Uncle Owen in those days with the MCG Damo or the MCC, they had ladies tickets, and Uncle Owen would always give Mum the ladies tickets because his wife Auntie Betty wasn't into it. Their seven kids weren't really into it, but Uncle Owen knew that Mum had three sons, particularly an older son in me, who was right into it. So she would take us to the members. We would sit where the cricketers would walk up after they were dismissed or come out after lunch, which is probably about half forward at the for those that are trying to work out where it was half forward at the western end of the MCG, on of course the member side of the ground, and we'd try and sit in the front row and try and pat the players as they came down to bat or came down after lunch, or came in after they were dismissed. And I just love those days. And one of the great days was 1977, and Mum took me to the centenary test. I was 8 years old. The second day, Australia made 138 on the first day, and Greg Chappell always said the 40 he made that day was one of the best innings he ever made. I think they're all a bit nervous because every living England and Australian test player that had played against each other had been invited. So it was a mighty effort by the Victorian Cricket Association and the Australian Cricket Board to get all those people here for the centenary test, celebrate 100 years since the first test. And Australia didn't bat all that well, but then the next day, Max Walker bowled brilliantly along with Dennis Lillee, who took 6 for 26, and Tangle's very lion-hearted, took 4, and he bowled Tony Greig with an in-swinging Yorker. And I don't think I've ever heard a bigger crowd. Might be equalled by 1981 when Dennis Lillee bowled Viv Richards on the last ball. And again, Mum had a ladies' ticket, took us there. Boxing Day after Kim Hughes made that great 100 under very tough conditions out of 173, and at stumps they were 4 for 10. So there were just some great memories as a kid going with mum to the cricket and also the football. And we thank my Uncle Owen for organising the ladies' ticket. And I know in later years, he used to get the ladies' ticket for mum, knowing that his own wife would never use it because she knew that it'd always be used by us.
What about the affiliation with the Bulldogs, Dan? When did that obviously really come about for you and originate from?
Well, I'm a bit of a sheep, Damo. I don't have a lot of ideas myself. You wouldn't call me a leader, even though my son captained his school. Or very proud of him to achieve that, Alex, back in 2023 at Sacred Heart. But it certainly wouldn't be my leadership skills he was able to develop. It was more from his mother, I think. But I digress, as I often do, as you know, Damien. But I followed Richmond in 1974, and our great neighbour, Carl McCarthy, who died in 2020 at the age of 100, and he's still the only Richmond supporter who was alive for all their premierships. He was a baby in 1921, 1922, and he actually was a week away from dying when they won that flag in 2020, of course, up in Brisbane during COVID against Geelong. So he's still got the record, and he was 100 when he died.
Mm.
His wife, Joan's still alive. She's 101. She turns 102 this year. They were great neighbours of ours. He took me to the footy. What I can remember, I was only 5, I was in grade prep, was I poured Coke on him. It was Richmond North, big game. North had improved that year, and Richmond were going for back-to-back flags. And I remember watching the end of the grand final. It was obviously a replay at home with mum and my brothers in our new house in Castle Street, where we lived for 25 years. And Royce Hart walking around with the Premiership Cup and thought, well, Richmond's my team. But then the new kid came into school in grade 1 at Mother of God Primary in East Ivanhoe in 1975. He wasn't with us in prep, but his father was a very well-known architect from Sunshine, Laurie Atley, very big in Rotary for a long time. Great man, Laurie. No longer with us either. God rest his soul. But Jack was a Bulldogs supporter or Footscray supporter, and people asked him, who do you follow Footscray? And I said, I follow Footscray too, because I think we're all enamoured by the new kid. And he used to stay at all our places because we all wanted to get in with the new kid instead of going home to Sunshine while his dad was still designing their new house in East Ivanhoe, near where the school was. So he'd often stay with us, and I got into the Bulldogs. Wasn't the smartest decision I made because, as my father used to say, when he was a Collingwood supporter, he said there'd be peace in the house if Footscray won. Unfortunately, Damo, probably between 1978 and 1982, there weren't a lot of wins. There were 7 wins in 78, there were 7 wins in 79, and under Royce Hart, before Bluey Hampshire took over, there were 8 wins to the middle of 1982 over 3 years. And in the end, they won another couple of games under Bluey. And it was a terrible season. So there were 10 wins between 1980 and 82. Obviously, after that, they got better. But yeah, it's been tough being a Bulldog supporter. I do love them. They drive me mad. I'm probably a glass 3/4 empty or in the covered Bulldog supporter. I don't have a lot of confidence in them, but yeah, I love them.
Yes, we all know about your affiliation with the Western Bulldogs, although that never came across in your commentary, which I think was a credit to you. Some might have a
Really?
different opinion, but certainly from my memory, it didn't come across. Yeah, probably the only time I can remember listening when I was about 9 years old to you calling, and when you speak about the Bulldogs struggling, 2004 was a year which they struggled, Dan. I remember you calling a game where Richmond played the Bulldogs in about round 8,
Yes.
and Richo
Sure.
kicked 10.
He had a
One
big
of
day.
the rare times he didn't miss for much
Yeah.
of the day. He kicked 10. And I remember your exasperated cry saying he's showing the Bulldogs how to kick because the Bulldogs kicked about 20 behinds that day from
Yes.
memory and lost the game. That was one of Richmond's few wins for the season. So I think that was the first time I discovered you were a Bulldogs fan.
Well, a lot of people actually knew I was a Bulldogs fan because I've got a very good friend who's mad keen Bulldogs. His family grew up in the western suburbs and are in the real estate industry. Hayden Stevens, who was one, he was a very young man when he helped save the Bulldogs from going under and joining Fitzroy at the end of the '89 season. And he was working with Peter Gordon at Slater and Gordon. And Peter was in the early stages of his career as a lawyer and took over as president, as we all know, Damien. And Hayden was just a young man. He just had graduated from law and was doing his articles. And he would listen to me and he would know straight away whether they were winning or losing if he steamed the radio on before he'd even hear a score. So I needed to work harder at that aspect. I mean, I would get excited when they were going well, but I was often very annoyed with them when they weren't going well. And I mean, you've got to be a bit more professional than that. The great Smokey Dawson used to say, "Dashing Dan, barracking while broadcasting." I mean, Drew Morford didn't have a team, and Glenn Mitchell was Carlton, but he didn't tell me till halfway through 1998 when I was working with him in Perth who he'd follow. And I mean, that is an art form. And the rest of us, I mean, we know Tim Lane's Carlton, but a great commentator. Gerard Whateley's Geelong, Anthony Hudson's Geelong. I mean, we get into it because we follow a team. And then we're lucky enough to have this ability to describe sport. We can all do it. Some can do it better than others. And some manage to achieve more than others as well. But I would have thought most of us get into broadcasting football, particularly in the southern states or the western states like WA, South Australia, Tassie, and Melbourne, because of our love of a certain team growing up, Damien.
Before we get on to the start of your commentary career, did any boss ever say to you, it's coming across that you're a Bulldogs fan, Dan, can you perhaps make it a little bit more impartial?
Not really. Not really. I mean, Glenn would always be big on just describing the action because he was such a pure commentator, just a great commentator and a wonderful teacher for me. Taught me a lot. Taught me how to prepare, which was I was okay at. I prepared, I thought, pretty well in Melbourne in my first year as a cadet, but gee, it went to another level. In fact, it went to four or five other levels the way Glenn used to prepare. I mean, he'd prepare that much stuff that he'd only use probably a quarter of it, but he'd still spend 4 or 5 hours preparing. And I started to do that. But oh, look, he just said you've got to be a little bit careful, and that's fair enough about making sure that you weren't too biased or you weren't too invested in the game. At the end of the day, it's just a game of footy. I mean, we're not saving lives. As the late great Drew Morford said, he was a great friend of mine who I loved broadcasting football with. He was such a great character. He said, if you're having fun, I dare say your audience will be having fun. It's all about having fun. If you're sitting there and you've been driven mad by how your team's going, as Drew used to say, you can't possibly be having fun. You can't get too invested in it. So there was not so much the managers, it was more my fellow commentators. Just call the game. Just have an open mind. If you have an open mind and there's plenty of clarity there, you'll do the best you possibly can and you'll be able to give the audience what they want. And if it's your own team and they happen to win, well, that just adds to the occasion. But don't get too involved in it. I mean, there were too many times I did get too involved in it. But I think at the end of the day, I managed to sort of reduce that involvement to some extent. Well, that's my opinion anyway. And as you know, I've got a favourite saying, opinions are like backsides, have all got one. Other people, Damien, may have a different view on that, but I felt that I was certainly better the longer I called in regard to calling the Bulldogs games and making it more impartial, which I needed to be, by the way.
We're interviewing Dan Lonergan on Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures for KISS Professional Solutions. Great supporters of the podcast. They have offices in Carrum Down, Sydney, Shepparton, Albury, and Gippsland. They service Wagga from their Albury office. Don't forget, you can contact them via phone on 1300 KISS PS. That's 1300 547777. Dan, radio was king. No doubt about that. Even though TV coverage did exist, it was more so in the replay form in the 1970s. Did your love for broadcasting spawn, like a lot of people, from listening to footy on the radio on a Saturday afternoon in the 70s?
Oh, absolutely. I loved it. I loved it. Dad used to give me one of his radios and I'd sit around the house and we had a fairly big sprawling house in Castle Street, big backyard, big front yard. And I'd sit under a tree or if it was wet, I'd sit upstairs, listen on the radio. And I used to love it. And of course, in those days, a number of stations did it. There wasn't a thing called rights. Damo, if you wanted to do it, you did it. 3R Low did it. And of course, the great Smokey Dawson, he'd call sometimes with Peter Booth, who, if he wasn't doing television, Clark Hansen would be on with him. John Waters would be on with him. You'd have Harry Beitzel, who probably changed the way radio was broadcast. He even introduced the pre-match at 12 o'clock in those days. He had Bill Jacobs. We know Bill's a pretty cantankerous man, but still a pretty good caller in those days, very scattergun style. Ray Young was the great stats man. Harry was the first man to bring in a stats man. And they got the pre-match interviews because Tommy laughed. Can you hear me, Harry? I can hear you, Tommy. You know, that with that voice that
Yes.
Tommy had, that very high-pitched voice, and he'd always be hovering somewhere down in the dressing rooms, and every player respected Tommy, and they would often give him before-match interviews, which never happened. I mean, we know the game was obviously not the professional game it is today, and there wouldn't have been media officers in those days at clubs. They might have had a secretary like Alan Schwab was a full-time secretary at Richmond before moving to the AFL, and maybe a part-time secretary in the office, a lady secretary looking after the other affairs. Nowadays, what do football clubs have employment-wise? Between 100 and 200 people. So it was great to listen to them, and I loved Ian Major and Jack Dyer. Jack Dyer would mangle the commentary, but and you think to yourself, he gets it wrong, but he's Jack Dyer. You just worked it out. And I absolutely love that. I'll listen a bit to 3GL if I could get them. And I even loved 3DB and 3UZ, even though I wasn't madly in love with the races. They'd only call when the races were on. But Mike Williamson called for them. Jeff Crouch called for DB. And then in 1984, when Kevin Bartlett retired and 3UZ changed their format to country music during the week, they called the footy on the weekend with Mike Williamson. And I used to love the around the grounds too, when people like Greg Brown at the ABC, Ray Walker, who I got to know when I was working with him, Ian Robinson, what a great caller Robbo became. Serge Silvani was at the ABC, Thorold Merritt. There was Gary Bryce, as Harry used to call him, not Gary Bryce, Gary Bryce, Gally, and Big El Martello. It was never El Martello, Damien, at 3AW. It was Big El Martello. And I used to love Ian Major. He'd go around the grounds. Bob Henderson at Fitzroy, Gerald Burke at Carlton, Teddy Whitten at Footscray. He wouldn't say what the ovals were. He'd just say where they were. It was just fantastic. And it was such a big part of my life on Saturday afternoon. And one thing I loved doing was I get the green guide out. They don't have it nowadays, but they used to have the radio guide down the bottom of the TV guide. And you'd try and work out what
Yes.
games the stations were doing. So you'd work out that the ABC might be doing the game this week between Carlton and Collingwood. Okay, they've got 5 other games, as you know, they're all played on Saturday involving Victorian teams. So you'd work out, would Greg Brown go there? Kevin Coughlin, there's a game at Waverley. Skeeter goes to VFL Park, so he'd go there. So you'd try and be a programmer yourself, which I eventually was years later, ringing commentators up saying, you're going here, you're going there, when I was the acting executive producer of the ABC when Tracy Parish left before Susie Robinson started in 2002. And I think to myself, gee, I used to do this just for fun as a little kid, trying to work out where all the around the grounders were going. Of course, that's no longer part of the coverage, which is something I certainly miss, but absolutely loved growing up. And radio was king. I love radio, and I always wanted to get into it. And I'd even listen to it in regard to music, 3XY, Double T, when it replaced 3DB, because my Datsun 120Y, my second Datsun 120Y, after I crashed the first one 2 weeks into driving when I fell asleep, but that's another story. I'm an interesting cat, Damien, as you know. But my Datsun 120Y didn't have an FM band. It was only AM band. So I'd listen to 3XY, people like John Hook and Kevin Hillier and who else? The 3XY Zoo, which was the
Richard
breakfast crew.
Stubbs.
Richard Stubbs was on. Peter Stubbs starting his career. Grubby, Ian Nichols, Laurie Atlas, Craig Huggins. I listened to Double T. So I was getting into music by then, the early to late 80s, and always the ABC, whether it be Alan McGilgray and then later on Jim Maxwell and Tim Lane for the cricket and the footy. Absolutely loved it. And that's where I think my passion and love for wanting to broadcast came from.
I was going to ask you what your favourite broadcast team was, but it sounds like you were pretty eclectic in your taste, Dan. You'd listen to a bit of everything, which is probably a good thing when it comes to developing your skills. Was there a particular broadcaster or set of broadcasters? And I know you've got to be yourself as a commentator. You've always got to develop your own style, but was there a couple that you tried to model yourself on in regards to professionalism? I'm not talking about when you first started, but when you were a kid.
Oh, Smokey Orson, love Smokey, the ball burster. And I was a little bit like that when I first started calling, and then he actually said to me, and others said to me, "You've got to be yourself, Dan. Be like Dan Lonergan. Don't be like Rex Hunt. Don't be like Smokey Dawson. If you want to make it, develop it yourself. Be like Dan Lonergan. And that's exactly right. But I mean, I love Smokey with his style, and even Peter Booth at times had a great line in the and look, nowadays, and I'm going to use it because it was acceptable to use in the 1980s. We know it's a more woke environment, but this is my podcast for KISS Professional Solutions. I think I'll get away with this, and I'm just paraphrasing Damien. He once used a line in Sydney: "Day costs more options than at King's Cross on a Friday night." I just love the colour. I love the colour of the way they used to call him. Peter was a very straight caller, and he taught me a lot when I went to the ABC and really moulded me into the ABC calling way, which I needed when I first went to the ABC as a cadet in 1997. But they were a great team, Peter and Graham. Peter was on television for a long time, as I mentioned earlier, but when they went into radio together for 4 or 5 years, and they had Doug Bigelow, they were a sensational team. They were great to listen to. I like Kevin Bartlett and Mike Williamson for the 2 years that it lasted at 3 years ahead. I wasn't a great fan of Bill Jacobs as a caller, but Harry was fantastic, and obviously Ian Major and Jack Dial. And Jack with his lines, making up his lines constantly, and the little fella down to the big fella, back to the little fella, over to the big fella, not really knowing the players. But as I said earlier, he was Jack Dyer, and it was great to listen to them and Mage with that big voice. And I thought to myself, well, Mage didn't play, Smokey didn't play, Peter Booth didn't play. Bill played a lot of cricket for Fitzroy Bill Jacobs. He didn't play football, but there's a chance for someone like me, particularly at the ABC, because they had proven broadcasters. They had professional broadcasters who'd wanted to do it and had obviously gone through the process of being a cadet mainly. Nowadays, of course, there's a lot more ex-players doing it, much to the chagrin of young guys trying to get in. And yourself's a great example of, and I've said this many times, I believe you should be calling more regularly than you are. I think you're an outstanding caller, and hopefully it'll come. You're still very young. I mean, I didn't start calling AFL footy till I was 25, and at the ABC till I was 28, and I had a long apprenticeship in the country. But I started calling footy in the country, which is very important to me, when I was 20. And I know people would say, well, it's different to AFL footy. Not that different, Damo. It's not that different. You've still got to know your names. In fact, it's harder to know the names in the country than it is in VFL, AFL footy, because you see them every week. But you learn who's got the football, where the footy is. In radio, I've always been a big, I suppose, advocate for giving the score as much as possible. You can never give the score often enough because people are dropping in and out of the coverage. You don't have to give it the full score of 18-11, 119 to 13-10, 88. You can say the Bulldogs by 31 points, St Kilda by 19 points or whatever. One stage their lead was 44. Richmond fighting back here, and because often the game's moving so quickly. But and also the other important thing is when there's a turnover, you need to say Hawkins kicks it for the Dogs, but it's turned over at halfback. Excellent mark taken by Sexton of Carlton, and he handballs out to Hunter, and the Blues are away. So those things you can still learn in the country, and I think that stood me a good stead when I was ready to move to AFL, because I'd had some experience calling, even though it wasn't AFL footy.
Talk to us about your apprenticeship, Dan. So I think you called, from what I understand, a bit of school footy at Xavier, and as you said, you did your long apprenticeship in the country, which sadly, because of the networking situation with radio now, there's not really a lot of opportunities in the country anymore. We see a lot of young people nowadays get their opportunity, and look, it's just as valuable a commodity when it comes to practicing. But there's probably more openings now with local football competitions in the metropolitan area, and they still cover country footy competitions as well. It's just you don't have as much radio out in those areas nowadays. Can you talk to us about how much you learnt for your apprenticeship, both at school level and at local footy level in the country, and how valuable it was?
Oh, it was very valuable. I mean, I will say this. Ace Network, who I called with at 3HA, they still do the local footy. They've got a number of stations now. They do the Ovens and Murray League. They'll call the Albury matches for 2AY. They'll do the Wangaratta Rovers and Wangaratta matches for 3NE. They'll do the Goulburn Murray League for Echuca. They've got an FM station in Echuca and an AM station. They do it off FM, and the AM take the AFL, and they'll do, that's a great comp. And Echuca are a very good side, and Warner will do the same with the Hampden League. And Hamilton take the Hampton League matches because their team's now in the Hampton League, and Colac do the Colac District Football League. So they still do it, but they mainly have older people that do it
Hmm.
and ex-players. They don't really have a lot of younger people doing it or people who are part of their advertising team. And if I can go backwards, you're right about streaming. I mean, as you know, I work for Gameface now, and we do the MPFNL. It's a great comp. We've got some young guys coming through, also with the Southern Football League and with the Outer East as well, and the Riddle Football League too, and even West Gippsland. And there's a lot of leagues that are streaming, aren't they? As you would know, VAFA, where you got your start. The Eastern Football League was another one, the Eastern District Football League. But I started back in Hamilton in 1989. I got my first gig there, and I worked with Rob Waters, who went to the ABC, and I worked with him later on, calling a lot of footy in the AFL. He's a great man to work with, Rob. Terrific caller, very colourful. One of his great lines was here before I started. It was a match between, it was an interleague match when the interleague was king. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. It was between Horsham and, the Wimmera Football League, of which Horsham was part of that, Ararat, etc. And also the Western Border League, which had those Victorian teams, Hamilton, Casterton, Imperials, Hamilton Imperials, Hayward, Portland, and then the Macambia sides, and Millicent. And a goal was kicked by the Wimmera team in the third quarter. And remember the great ad Milo's, marvellous what a difference Milo makes. Oh, Marlowe's kicked a great goal. It's marvellous what a difference Marlowe makes. It's one of the great lines of all time. And that was typical Rob. He's a very colourful caller, and it was sensational to call with him. So I started calling it 3HA, and I heard about this job when I was at very good friends of mine, Tony and Cheryl Francis, great friends of mine from radio school. I made a lot of friends at a radio school with Clark Sinclair. I didn't get a job from Clark, but I worked at his radio school. He had a radio station out the back that he opened on a Friday night, the back of his house, and we'd go there and learn how to play records and back announce and forward announce and do the racing coverage on a Saturday and give footy scores, etc. So it was a good grounding for us, but he didn't get as many jobs as he probably should have with the experience he had. But I went up to Tony and Cheryl's place in early 1989. It was Cheryl's 25th birthday. And it was also they're having a housewarming because Tony had got his job in Horsham, working at 3WM, and Cheryl was going to be obviously living with him now that they'd got engaged. And I ran into a bloke called Carl Liebold, who was working in Hamilton. He's about to leave. So he's working in Horsham. He just left Hamilton. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I've been trying to get to radio, but I think I might go back to uni and do a public relations course down at Warrnambool." I got into one a couple of years ago, but I deferred so I could try and get to radio. I haven't got in. He said, "What area?" I said, "Oh, I'm into sport, so it's a bit specialised." And he said, "Well, Hamilton are looking for a part-time sports broadcaster because Ross Wilson, who's been there a long time, who's also head of sales, has decided to open up a fish and chip shop, which ironically for Big Roscoe didn't last too long." So anyway, there is a job going. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I just happen to have tapes with me. I always carry tapes with me. You just never knew. I I would go down there. The problem was there was no train between Horsham and Hamilton, but Tony and Cheryl, being very nice and being great people and great friends, drove me down there. And I just turned up to see Jeff Tuckett out of the blue. Left him a tape and thought, didn't hear any more of it. And the season's getting closer. And Dad said, well, if you're going to go there, you need to go and probably study. So I thought I'd study a business course off campus at the small Hamilton campus of the Warrnambool University at Deakin. So I thought I'd do that. And I rang them up and said, look, I've a chance of getting into this course. Are you interested in me or not? And in the end, they went for me. I don't think they were sure what they were getting themselves in for. And look, it was tough early days, and but I was starting to find my way, I think, with Rob. But then he got an opportunity to go to Hobart with the ABC. A gig came up, and he went down there. And here's this 20-year-old kid who's as green as green as green, Damian, who hadn't lived out of home but wanted to move out of home, but wasn't ready to move out of home. Had no idea about living out of home, no idea how to cook, no idea how to clean, no idea how to do many things at all, who was thrust into running the broadcast. Now, I was terrible technically, so I mucked up a few times, whether it be at the Casterton races or even calling the footy early days at Portland. And it probably wasn't until Leo O'Brien was an ex-umpire who was a local Hamilton guy. He called with me for the second half of the year, and then a lifelong friend of mine, Phil Shaw, replaced Rob. He hadn't called any footy. He called one game off the TV to get the job. He came in. We had a good year in '89. It was a good competition. I got better and better the longer the year went on. I made some silly comments which I can't say nowadays, that probably could have cost me my job. But I think because the exuberance of youth, Jeff let me go, and I was just new to it all. But I think he was impressed by the end of the year how much I'd cottoned on, and I was running the sport. We had a sports show on Saturday morning, so we were learning a lot. It was fantastic. And then Leo went away, as often happens in radio. There's an opportunity. They always say, they certainly used to say when I was growing up, Damo, never take a holiday because you never know who might replace you. So anyway, Phil came in and replaced Leo. Leo's gone away on holidays. And I know Jeff, our boss, was very keen for Leo to come back and commentate. But I thought it was time for Phil. He was employed to replace Rob to come in as a commentator. And our PD at the time was a bloke you would remember from Sport 927, Brian Mazzoletti, who went there and, of course, was one of the great
Yes.
racing coordinators. He has since left radio and is now a train driver. A great man, Maz, lovely man.
Main drive. Yeah.
He backed us. I said to him, Brian, he's this young 21-year-old kid. We talked to Sam Constance a bit earlier, a little bit cocky, but I've said, bad luck, Leo, going on holidays, but you employed Phil to be the broadcaster. I reckon he's ready. And now this is a guy that I think could have made it. He had a great way with words. We had a wonderful year in 1990. It was a terrific comp. Casterton won the premiership, their first since 1969. They'd recruited a very good side from out of town. They all got jobs with the various businesses in town and just out of town a bit. Casterton, for those that don't know, is a town 60 k's west of Hamilton, near the South Australian border. And they were a very good side. They beat Hamilton in the grand final, and Hamilton had a bloke called Billy Picken playing for them. And we always used to hear, of course, we couldn't hear it ourselves, but we used to hear the stories. Billy be taking a mark in the AFL or VFL, and you'd hear him say, Mark McClure used to be driven mad by it. They were great mates, though. And he said, here comes Billy. And, of course, being in country footy, Damo, you could hear Billy. Here comes Billy. And he'd take these great marks, whether it be at centre half forward or at centre half back. And Hamilton went on to play Casterton in the grand final. Phil and I had a great year, and Phil was a magnificent caller with the right environment. He was a bit older than me. He was, almost 40 at the time. He's now, 73. I think he could have kicked on. And I believe that he had the mannerisms of Dennis Committee. The voice wasn't as deep as Dennis. I know this is a massive call, but Tony Lithgow was the star player for Casterton and kicked 7 in that grand final and got belted when he was about to kick his 7th and got a 15-metre penalty. And Phil, just the capturing of the moment, which we're all talked about being able to do on radio, said, Tony Lithgow has got 7 goals and a mouthful of blood. Now, I called pretty well. I called very straight. I was able to understand the action, but I couldn't come up with the comments like that. So I was lucky enough to work with someone like Phil, and I think in different times, he could have been one of the great broadcasters of all time. But it was a great experience those 2 years. Loved every single minute of it. Elected to go overseas with the family at the end of 1990. And as I said to you a bit earlier, if you take a holiday and you come back, your spot often isn't there. But I think it was the precociousness of youth. I didn't really get on with the boss. I didn't get on with the new PD who'd replaced Brian. I was creating waves, which became a bit of an issue for me as the years went on, Damo. And I think they were happy to see the back of me. And then in 1991, I didn't have much work, and I rang up Bob Harding, who was also on the Ace Network at Horsham. They didn't do footy. They did the AFL instead, but they had a sports show. A mate of mine, Tony Francis, had replaced Phil, who'd left Hamilton as well. He'd had enough of the environment there, gone back to Melbourne to work in sales. He does regret that decision. Tony was a great mate of mine, as I said earlier. He'd gone to Hamilton and very good broadcaster. And I said to Bob, look, I'd love to come up and see you. He said, I haven't got a job for you, son, but you can come up. Anyway, I had a Datsun 120Y those days, Damian. So I've gone up there and I'm waiting at the front desk, and Bob's come out and said, who's driving that piece of crap that's parked outside my radio station? And 3WM in Horsham, which is 4 hours from Melbourne, fair way, is on the river. And I said, oh, that's me, Bob. Oh, you're here, son. Oh, it got me from Melbourne to Horsham. I don't know how it did. And he said to the girls that were in the office with him, we've got a smart ass here, ladies. Get in my office, son. Anyway, we got in the office and we just started chatting. And we got halfway through and he said, how much do you want? And I said, how much do I want for what? for doing the sports show on Thursday night, the footy show, and a little bit of AFL preview on Friday. It's only a day and a half's work for you. I said, you told me there wasn't a job. He said, listen to me, son. Tony Francis did the Thursday night footy show as well as breakfast. You're not doing breakfast. I've got someone to replace him, but I need someone to do my Thursday night footy show. Anyone who drives up from Melbourne to Horsham in that piece of crap that is parked outside my radio station and is bringing down the value of my radio station has got guts and orchestras, balls, and is keen. So I'm going to give you a job. So anyway, I worked there and then got a job within 4 months. One of the news journalists left, and that's when all the news came out of one station, went around Colac, went around Hamilton, and Swan Hill and Horsham. They were the four stations owned by Ace, and I got a job as a cadet journalist. So I developed another skill set. Long answer, sorry.
Funny, isn't it, Dan? In real estate, you need an expensive car to get work and to get a job and increase sales. In radio, you need a poor car and you get a job.
Well, it was funny. I mean, he looked at he looked
So
at me.
you did, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Dame. I was just going to say sorry about that. Yeah, he looked at me and thought this guy wants it, and that's why he gave me a job. He needed someone to fill the job. He could have got a local person who knew the leagues, and there were new leagues that I had to look at. The North Central League, good comp. Watcham, Corag, Donald, Witchy Proof, Narraport, the Wimmera League, of course, I mentioned before. The Lexington Plains League no longer exists. The Ararat District no longer exists. So there were some good comps, and also there are a couple of other leagues as well that no longer exist. But it was a terrific experience, and then we did a summer sports show as well as something extra before I got the job in the newsroom. So it was just all good experience, Damo. I loved it.
That's it. It served you well going forward. So, talk to us about your first foray into the metropolitan area, Dan. So, I understand we're still in the early 90s. Did you get your first crack? I'm basing this off memory, but was it 1992 you got your first crack at AFL level? It wasn't necessarily with the ABC, but was it 6PR going into Perth from Melbourne? Is that right?
It was 1994. I moved to Colac in 1993 because what they did was at ACE,
Uh,
they elected to split the news and have a news journalist out of each station, which I think works. Pretty hard being a news journalist and ringing uh, the person around the hospital at Colac or Swan Hill and not really knowing the stories. It was good to have someone in each station. And both the journalists who've been at Horsham with me, Sue and Debbie, resigned. Sue resigned and Debbie elected to go back into newspapers, into the Weekly Times. She's very good as an agricultural journalist. That was probably her strength. She was good on radio as well. So I could have stayed in Horsham. I had a lot of mates. I loved the St Michael's Cricket and Football Club. They eventually became Horsham Saints in the Wimmera District League, and Joel Fraser and the Berry brothers and Darcy Tucker have gone on to have good AFL careers from the Horsham Saints over the last 10 years or so. Or I could have gone to Colac, who were doing some local footy, but they had a lot of good commentators based in Geelong and Colac, Warren Richards and Jeff Peel. And I didn't want to be seen to be I suppose, stepping on their toes, but I still wanted an opportunity. In the end, I chose Colac, a bit closer to Melbourne as well, that if an opportunity came up, I could go to Melbourne. So I called in 1993, and some games, we called the interleague final that Hampton won over Murray, up at Baruga. It was a great day, and players like Bernie Harris, ex-Fitzroy, played for Hampton, kicked 5 to win the game. Ben Eggleton, ex-St Kilda, came down from Ballarat to have a year at Camperdown. John O'Hearn played a bit of AFL footy. It was a pretty good team, Hampton. It was a pretty good comp as well. I called the grand final between Colac and Terang. We called it out of the car, the company car, and we called it on a mobile phone. Myself and a bloke called Graham Hillman, who's no longer with us because there weren't enough boxes on the wing at the Reed Oval. We called behind the goals. Reed Oval, Warrnambool, great ground, beautiful ground, like the QEO at Bendigo. Grounds that should be used more often to play practice matches. Not that they play many practice matches in the AFL nowadays, Damien, but even in the VFL, beautiful ground. And it was a great game of footy, called reasonably well. And then I heard Anthony Hudson was leaving 6PR to go to 3AW, and he'd been calling with Smokey. And I thought, I'm going to have a crack here. So I put a tape in, and Shane Douglas liked it, and I got the gig. I was wrapped. Couldn't believe it. And then I met a great
wow.
mate of mine, Bill Hodgetts, who you might know of. Billy Amp's his nickname. and he was doing the stats, and he's also a great mate of Smokey's. And I met him the day of the South African Test match because I wanted to go and see Smokey, and I had a pass because I was doing some work for 3AW, helping Shane Healy out with the cricket, doing some work experience. It was the South African Australian Test, first test for what 23 years, and it was rained out most of that Test match. It was a shocker, but it was good going in there. And I met Billy, and we became lifelong mates, and met Smokey. I thought I'd be calling with one of my heroes, Graham Smokey Dawson. But a couple of months before the season started, Damo, Collingwood and Footscray decided to get extra money. They would set up their own broadcast by using community stations. Now, Collingwood used the station in Ivanhoe, and Footscray used the station in Sunshine. I also called on that station the next year. And Harry Beitzel called on both. He also set up a very successful Thursday night selectors table at Footscray, where a lot of the Footscray supporters, before the footy show, which we know started in 1994 and became king, they'd go in early, have their dinner on a Thursday night. They'd have a couple of guests come up with Tommy Laeth and Harry from the Footscray team and speak about the upcoming match. But they'd also call the games on Saturday, and Smokey decided he'd do that. So we needed another call, and Rob Gaylard had called a lot of country footy and a little bit for Channel 9. And I think they had a state championship in the mid 80s or late 80s with Lou Richards.
Yep.
He hadn't called a lot of AFL, so he and I called AFL. We didn't really gel. We didn't really gel. He's a very good man when it comes to horse racing and harness racing. Again, no longer with us, Rob. Died way too young, but terrific in that sport. That was his sport, but not so much in footy. And we're both fighting for the same role, and we weren't really helping each other out. But it was good experience. But 6PR also had the races, Damo. So we didn't call a lot on Saturday. Our better games were on Sunday. And I called better the longer the season went. I remember calling Craig Bradley's magnificent goal around the outer wing against West Coast in 1994 when the Blues were flying. Then, of course, they lost both finals. And I thought I might have been a chance to call the grand final, but they had the West Australian pair of Percy Johnson and Trevor Sprigg come over. But in hindsight, I probably wasn't quite ready. And I needed a bit more experience. I wasn't really using binoculars yet, and that was causing me to make some errors with players. I didn't really know hadn't really learned how to use them yet. I mean, Bill Jacobs spent an entire career not using binoculars. Incredible. It wasn't until 1991 when 3AW elected to, when they had the new boxes downstairs, 3AW elected to be right up in the TV box up the back at Waverley when they were having a lot of the footy there because they were renovating the southern stand at the MCG. That's when Bill, who was getting on a bit by then, but still a pretty good caller, was really struggling because he never used binoculars. But binoculars, as you would know, Damien, the tools of the trade. And it took me probably until I got to the ABC in 1997 and a lot of support from Bill Hodges, great mate of mine, in encouraging me before I was comfortable using them. And now, of course, I wouldn't be without them. They're so important.
It does take practice to use them. I think people don't realise there is a bit of a skill to actually putting them up to your eyes without breaking stride. I think it's something that's, at least in my view anyway, a little bit understated as a skill. Once you get used to them, though, it's very easy to identify players by comparison to not using them. We're speaking with Dan Lonergan, all with thanks to KISS Professional Solutions. They have offices in Carrum Down, Sydney, Shepparton, Albury and Gippsland. They service Wagga from their Albury office, and you can contact them on 1300 KISS PS. That's 1300 5477 777. Now, Dan, I just wanted to go back a bit in that 94 season to your first game. I think it was Essendon v West Coast, round 1, 1994. Do you remember how nervous you were and how you called that day and just the occasion? It was a tight game too, from memory.
How old were you? You were a baby, weren't you?
No, I wasn't even born yet.
Weren't you? Oh, God. You are a freak. I mean, just all this stuff, you retain this information. I mean, you got to remember, I don't have a bad retention of memory, but I've lived a lot of this stuff. This man, ladies and gentlemen, he's a freak. He's a star. Yeah, I remember it well. I was nervous. Billy and I had spoken a lot during the week, and I was really nervous, hoping I'd do a good job. But I knew that the races were on, so it was going to be hard to get any form of flow going. So it'd be back and forth a bit throughout the day, and it ended up being a pretty close game. I think I called okay, but in horse racing terms, I was hoping for the run. I needed the run, and obviously there weren't a heap of games. There might have been 8 by memory. And as you know, they also played matches interstate as well, and they often sent their own commentators interstate. I know Smokey used to travel with them before 1994 and after when he went back to 6PR. But I knew I'd only have the 8 games, so I needed to make each post a winner. But that first game, I was really nervous, but gee, I was excited because you had a huge crowd, and Essendon were the reigning premiers, and it was just wonderful being there. And it was surreal too. You looked at all the other boxes and saw the greats: Tim Lane, Peter Booth, Rex Hunt, Shane Healy. There were some wonderful people around. I mean, the Channel 7 commentators would come in because they used to share the same area to get a cup of tea in the radio boxes coming from the TV area. It was a fantastic feeling. And I thought, I'm getting there. I hadn't made it yet. I've got to be able to do a good job. I mean, you've made it in that you've got an opportunity to call at the highest level. But to me, making it is being asked to come back again and then being told you're doing a good job. Keep doing it. Keep improving. If you're not asked to come back again, which I wasn't in 1995 because they wanted to use Simon Beasley who was our expert. Simon, again, wasn't a great caller, but a Western Australian person, and they wanted to identify with a Western Australian person. And he was a huge WA person, despite having spent, what, 43 years of his life after his first 24 in Western Australia in Melbourne. He's now a Melburnian here. He's married a Melburnian girl, and his kids are grown up here. But he was still a big Western Australian person back in 1994. And an opportunity came up in 1995, and Rob had a higher profile than me, even though I was disappointed because I still felt that I was the level of Rob. I mean, you do get disappointed, but at the end of the day, management makes the decision. I've always backed myself, Damo, but people have often said to me, maybe, Dan, you don't back yourself enough. And that might be right, but I still believe I've got the ability to do it, whether it be football, any sport. But management, no matter what radio station it's been, and the ABC has been a big part of my life for 18 years, I've never been 100% sure that a lot of management at the ABC thought I was that good. And that's maybe why I doubted myself a bit. And certainly 6PR made that decision. I was disappointed. Did I deserve another go? I thought so. But you just hope that something else came up, and Bulldog Radio did. And then even the station for the blind, 5RPH over in Adelaide, needed a caller. I called with David Hooks a couple of times, and that was great fun as well with the Adelaide Crows matches. So I got a bit of an opportunity in 1995 and called the grand final, Carlton and Geelong out of the smoker stand, which used to be the old radio boxes well before I was born, many, many years before you were thought of too, Damo. But that was a great experience calling with Hooksy the Carlton Geelong grand final, which the Blues won comfortably in a very one-sided season.
What was David Hooks like? Because obviously he died far too young. It was a big, well, he ended up becoming a big name in the media in Melbourne with his role on Sports Today on 3AW. I think people
Now, probably young people wouldn't realise how big of a name he was as a radio personality. He was very opinionated, but he had that cut through, didn't he? What were your memories of working with him? Was he difficult to work with? Was he a character? Was he good to work with? Did he mentor you?
Oh, he did. Yeah, he was good. He was a nice bloke, Hooksy. He and I got on pretty well. He always used to rag me. I mean, even when he was coaching Victoria quite a few years later, not long before he died, sadly. And he'd always get into me because I knew him. And I remember one day I said, guys, can I go first? Because I had to get away and try and get an interview in before grandstand ended. All the media were there after Victoria had a win. And I asked 4 questions. And he said, you hog, have you finished now? I said, and I just asked the first 4 questions and he got into me. So, and I think that had a lot to do with the year that we had together. And we only called 3 or 4 matches, but it was good fun because he was very giving. He was friendly. And he said, yeah, you're quite good at this, Dan. You're getting better and you're getting to know the players better. It wouldn't be easy with the Adelaide players, and we didn't have great facilities or great gear either, but it was a tremendous experience to call with someone like David Hooks, who was a very, very good broadcaster and was certainly developing a great career out of it. Was he a great caller? I'm not sure he was a great caller, but I think he was very, very good on air with his opinions. And he obviously knew sport well. He knew cricket pretty well. He knew footy well. And being a South Australian, and he sort of just coming to the Victorian market, I think it was exactly what 3RW needed. It's exactly what the sporting media landscape needed. someone who had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder being a South Australian, or as Roger Wills from the ABC would say, he was coming into the Mexican market in Victoria. He used to call us Mexicans because we were over the border. Hooksy added a lot, I think, and he was a great person to get to know, and it was very, very sad when he died. It hit everyone for a long, long time, and I still reckon there's quite a few people that aren't over it, even though, what, it's more than 20 years ago now, Damien.
That's right. It was quite a shock in early 2004. I just wanted to ask you, Dan, you mentioned the element of self-belief. And I think
It's something you need as a broadcaster. It's probably harder than you think to try.
try and acquire yourself. Depends how much of an ego you have. I guess some people have a lot of self-belief. Some people don't have enough. I'm probably in the same camp as you in that it probably takes a while. I still don't have a lot of self-belief, to be honest with you, and you need that bit of help from management or externally, even in general, to feel like you belong. Is it something you felt you never quite 100% achieved? Was it something, did you need someone to really back you? I suppose you always do in the media, don't you? It really comes down to a decision maker. But was it something you struggled to attain, I guess, on a regular basis, self-belief?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think that I worried too often. I think I said to you a little bit earlier about Glenn Mitchell, about having clarity, about having a clear head. If you have a clear head and you've got clarity in your mind, I think that helps you perform well. I mean, there are days when I'd occasionally, and it used to annoy the hell out of me, I'd get ahead of myself. I think, gee, I'm flying today. Like at cricket, I might do my first two 20-minute stints going brilliantly, and then you make an error because you're looking too far ahead. Or you might have got a magnificent first innings. So I didn't do any test matches. So I'm thinking of maybe doing 3 or 4 20-minute stints in the first of a 50 over one day international. And I'm thinking to myself, I've got the field placings right today, and I would only get the field placings wrong when maybe a left hand or right hand to change, and you would have a Freudian slip, which means you don't know you've said it, that you've said the left handers
Yeah.
nudged it to mid wicket. You don't nudge to the onside. You're nudging to the offside more often than not. You might flick to the onside, if you know what I mean. And then you make one error and you think, oh, it's all over. And then you make another one. So, same with the footy, same with all the sports. But at the end of the day, if they didn't think you could do it, they probably wouldn't have you doing it. But there were times when, even at the ABC, they would use the part-time commentators, and they had a full-time commentator there. I thought to myself, they've still got to pay the full-time commentator. Obviously, you don't have a lot of confidence in him, that they're paying a part-time commentator to call the games. And that would play on my mind. It wouldn't help the home environment either, in regard to I'd be thinking about it the whole time. I wish I was doing it. I should be doing it. Why am I doing it? Why is he doing it? I'll be ruminating. And you're right. It would play on your confidence, and you'd feel like you'd let people down. You'd feel like it's all over. There'll be no opportunities. And it took management a long time to be able to accept me. There was some management at the ABC that thought I lacked depth in my commentary. Now, I'm not sure about that. I remember when I left the ABC, and you can remember the footy forums they used to put up. They were very basic and rudimentary in those days. All footy forums, and all the supporters would get on. You wouldn't just have an individual club. And they said, it was very nice what they said. Sad to see Dan Lonergan go. He's the best line and length AFL commentator we've got on radio, which is very nice. I mean, I could throw colour in, but I'd like to think that was my strength. But if I lacked depth because I was a line and length commentator, I didn't quite understand. I mean, you wouldn't be told where you needed to improve. They'd just say, oh, no, we prefer others. And that was pretty hard to take, because I worked very hard on trying to be the best I could. I worked very hard on trying to be the best, full stop. Now, looking back, it's been 10 years since I left the ABC, and a long time since I've been doing mainstream sports broadcasting on a regular basis, Damien. And I look back and think, well, I should have had a different attitude. I had a great job, good family life, the job of my dreams, broadcasting sport. If you're not number one, it doesn't matter. You're still broadcasting plenty of great sporting events. I went to 3 Olympic Games, and you've even said that to me, that the amount of trips I've had on a plane to go and do a sporting event. It doesn't happen as often nowadays. COVID came in, and as you know, radio stations, TV stations, they're sort of coming out of that a bit now, but they changed because they thought, well, we can save money, and of course they can save money, and you get a great big screen, and you just change your technology a bit. It's not the same as being there, as we know. And I did a lot of travelling to Brisbane. Quentin Hull and I became a great team, but I should have just realised I'm good. Be happy with how you're going and back yourself. Okay, management have been given the decision to decide whether you're on or not. But when you're given an opportunity, make sure you get it right. So they then can't say to you, I think you're struggling, unless they have a set against you. And whether there was a set against me, I'm not sure, Damian, but at the end of the day, they obviously rated others, and that was out of my control. I mean, one thing I've learned a lot too with my mental health, and since I haven't been involved in sports broadcasting full time, just control what you can control. A lot of things you can't control in life. You can't control how people feel about you, but what you can do is you can perform at the best of your ability. And if you're happy with how you performed, well, that should be enough at the end of the day, even if you're not making the decision.
Busy with Dan Lonergan on Daffy Dan's Sporting Adventures. I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned 1995 and I guess trying to feel your way in the AFL sphere. It was an interesting landscape at the time. It was before Triple M came in on FM. So you had probably the two main, well, the big dogs were 3AW and the ABC. Magic were also on the seat at that point. And I think I remember you telling me you called the merger match with Brian Taylor. How did the Magic thing open up?
Well, what happened there was I was working at that was 1995, wasn't it? Or, no, not 1996, I think it was, during the Olympic Games. And there was an opportunity to call, and I got in touch with Shane Healy, and he gave me a chance to do it, and I managed to get that opportunity. And look, it was a good experience. I think I did okay, and I was hoping for more opportunities. But later in the year, I had to make a decision. When I think this was very early in the year when Smokey was unavailable. I can't remember the exact details, and I think I did okay. And it was good working with Brian. Brian was very new at the time. I didn't think he was going to become as big a celebrity in the media as he has now. I thought he was an okay caller, but he was still an ex-player. And I thought, I think he'll be okay. I'm hoping I'm going to be okay. And I just had a job to do. I know I was pretty nervous. But then there was an opportunity later in the year, and I didn't take that opportunity because I was at Fox, and I didn't even ask them. I probably could have asked them. I was doing the weekend sports at Fox, and they'd give me a chance early in the year, and I just thought, oh, I can't really ask them. And I didn't, and I elected to stay at Fox. It was a tough decision. I thought, have I blown it full time, a chance to call AFL footy by turning down an opportunity? It was a decision that I wrestled with for a long time, and I'm very poor at making decisions at the best of times. And that was as tough a decision as I've had to make. And I was lucky enough that, of course, the ABC cadetship came around later that year, and I got in 1997. But I remember thinking, am I going to regret this? Give someone else an opportunity. And at the end of the day, we're all competing, aren't we? But I had to be true to myself, and the crew at Fox FM, Ken Kavanagh and the coach and Brad McEwen had backed me when my skills technologically were dreadful, Damien. But they said because they felt that I wanted it badly enough, I had to take that opportunity on. But any experience that you get does help you. And that certainly helped me with Brian Taylor and Shane Healy. It would have been nice to have done a few more games, but at the end of the day, I went to the ABC the next year, so I was lucky enough to get my chance.
Talk to us about the cadetship opportunity that opened up. Did you see it's a bit different back then, probably compared to now, where you see jobs online? How did you see the opportunity? How were you made aware of it? And what was the cadetship process like in terms of getting in?
Well, I'll take you back a step. 1995, the day that Murali got called for no ball in the Test cricket by Darryl Hare. Peter Booth was calling because they didn't have a Sri Lankan international caller. And I asked him, there was this young kid who was starting to emerge, who'd won a cricket calling competition called the late Clinton Grivis. And Peter loved him. He was from out that side of town too, out Vermont side, out Warrandyte side, I think. And he's only 20. And I heard him and thought, geez, he's good. And eventually he called in 1996. Bobby Skilton started calling and his mic wasn't working. He was on the Drew. And Clinton started calling and just was like he'd been calling forever. Anyway, in 1995, I asked Peter, I'd been calling for Bulldog Radio. I called the final between Footscray and Geelong, and they got absolutely annihilated in that elimination final. It was the old final system, the one that was no good, in my humble opinion. First against eighth, second against seventh, etc. Geelong were much too good, much too good. Footscray had a lot of injuries, but Geelong was still much too good. And anyway, I was calling with Tony Shebeki and Ian Major. John Waters, who'd also called with us that year, had sadly dropped dead of a heart attack. He called with Smokey a lot at the ABC about 10 or 12 years earlier, and Peter. So I've turned up, and he thought I was okay. He gave me some areas to work on that driving medium traffic. You're a bit full on the way you're calling. You've got to be ready to get up instead of being up already. You don't want to be calling with the dogs, or as I call it, Randy Meisnerish, the great singer from the Eagles, who'd sing with the dogs with "Take It to the Limit" and "One of These Nights," two of the great songs from the Eagles from the mid-70s. So you want to be building. He said, just work on that. He said, but you're not bad. So anyway, I thought, well, that's terrific advice to have. As I said, 1996, I didn't really call much. And then later in the year, when the second magic opportunity could have come up, didn't come up. And Peter Booth was talking to a few people in the media centre at the MCG one day, and Jock Clark from Bendigo was actually calling with Brian Taylor. And Peter said, well, what about the young bloke from Colac? I reckon he's all right. He could have done it. And Billy, my mate, said, well, Peter, he was asked, but he was working for Fox FM. He had another commitment. He was the first person asked, but turned it down. Okay. Anyway, in October that year, this great big envelope from the ABC came to 3CS's office, the biggest envelope I've ever seen in my life. Inside was a very small piece of paper that had been cut out from the Australian newspaper. And then there was a note. Dan, this is the job advertisement. They're deciding to put on a couple of cadets for the first time in a long time. There'll be a job in Sydney, a job in Melbourne. Good luck, Peter B. P.S. Clinton will also be applying for it. It'll be tough competition, but I wish you all the best. That was it. I wouldn't have, normally in those days, not online, the ABC would put their jobs in the Australian or the Age. And there was always a massive job section that doesn't really exist nowadays. I mean, the Age, when I was a kid, it was that big, you needed a crane on Saturday to pick it up and bring it up and bring it up the driveway, Damian. That's how big it was. It was massive. It was a huge newspaper. And half of that was to do with the jobs in the middle. It would have been 10 or 15 or 20 pages of jobs. So anyway, I've applied. I put my application in. I had a good friend of my former wife, Joanne Stanley, helped me out. She was sensational, the way that she put it together for me. And I put the application in. I remember one day I'm driving home from Colac. I'd had enough. Boss and I weren't getting on. I'm sick and tired doing the news. I was living in Geelong because I've worked at Bay FM and I moved up to Geelong with them, and I didn't want to go back to Colac. My life was in Melbourne. On the weekend, I was happy in Geelong. I was driving home, and a girl that I knew from who read the news at Warrnambool, Ace had just bought that station, 3YB Warrnambool, Sarah Pennycook. She rang me and she said, have you heard about the ABC job? I said, oh, no, I haven't. I must find out why I've missed it. I reckon I've missed. Anyway, I got off the phone and my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. There were a few calls. And there was one from Caroline Davison. Hello, Dan. Caroline had a very cultured voice. She was originally from Zimbabwe. She was married to Brian Davison, Damian, who came out to Tasmania and played Shield cricket for them for a few years between 1979 and 1984. And she stayed, and I think the marriage broke up. But she was really good for the ABC, and she was Neville's right-hand person. Neville Oliver, who was the boss at the time, and said, you've been chosen for the job interview for the two cadetship positions that we've got in Sydney and Melbourne. We need you to be in Sydney next week for the job interview. I thought, well, I don't miss too many days at work. And I thought, how am I going to do this? So anyway, I told my program director, I didn't tell the boss, I didn't get on with him, and I told another lady who was like an institution at the station. And I said, look, this is what I'm doing. I'm being honest. And they were rap for me. And I just said, I'm going to be unavailable. I've got a family commitment, Rob. I won't be available, but I'll do the news. Someone else did it anyway, the news. I couldn't have the news done the day before just in case something happened, not that it ever did, whether it be a car crash or whatever on the day. So I went and did the interview, rolled up at the terminal, and Clinton was there, sat next to him, didn't really talk to him because we didn't know each other, but we introduced each other, introduced ourselves, went in, and we had to answer all these questions. And Peter Newlands was also in the interview. I can't remember any of the others at this stage. Clinton and myself, and we got all bar one question right in the questions about sport knowledge. So we've made a good start. We then had to do an interview in front of a panel, of which Neville Oliver was one of them. We were then given an opportunity to call either one round of a boxing bout, and I hadn't called much boxing, or an over of cricket. And I chose what I thought would be the safe option. It was the recent series between Australia and the West Indies. Robert Samuels was the opening bat for the West Indies, 96, 97. I think Shane Warne was bowling. Michael Bevan might have been bowling to him. And I had to describe 6 balls that he just blocked. I think I did okay. And then we had to do a piece to camera, which I was very nervous about because I had never done anything to camera before. And as you know, I've got a very good head for radio. I'm ugly as a hatful, Damian. Even then, at 27, I'm now 56. So a little bit more hair then, but not much. So anyway, I did it, and I thought I've done pretty well here, but I always thought Clinton would get the Melbourne job. I didn't hear anything. And those are the days you wouldn't take your phone everywhere. And I mean, they were the big brick phones. But it was getting Christmas week, and I was starting to panic a bit. And I would take my phone everywhere. I thought, this is ridiculous. Anyway, I rang the guy that had been in the process, a guy called Don Lang. And he said, no, you've missed out. Clinton's got Melbourne. Peter Newlands has got Sydney. But George Griliusitz has left Perth, going back to marry his second wife. He needs to buy a new house for her. And he wants to be able to use his superannuation from the ABC. And he's been offered a job at 6PR. So there's a job in Perth. We want you to apply for it. If Clinton doesn't go, you're a good chance of getting it. You're the next cab off the rank. So I did a pretty good job because the pressure was off. I reckon I did a better job at that interview than I did with the cadetship because the pressure was off. Anyway, I wanted to find out what was going on. I'd had a blue with management again at 3CS. What they decided to do, the manager in Horsham, who's now the CEO of ACE, and they've got a number of stations. I mentioned earlier, Deniliquin and Albury and most of Victoria now, Traralgon, etc. He and the manager at Colac were good mates. They wanted me out. So they said, what we're going to do, Dan, is for you to stay here, we're going to change the way we do the news from Monday to Friday to Tuesday to Saturday, which means you'll record Monday's news on Saturday. So if there's a big accident, Damien, on the Princess Highway, or a big story occurs on Saturday or Sunday, we miss it. We miss it because there's no one in the newsroom on Monday. And I knew my time was up. So I resigned. But it was just in the middle of something maybe happening at the ABC. Anyway, as soon as I resigned, they resorted back to the news being Monday to Friday. So at the end of the day, it was ridiculous. And I had grounds to sue them if I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew my time was up. I needed to get out. And I was thinking of going back to uni if I didn't get the job. And I still had the Fox job too. So I could keep doing that for as long as I wanted. And that was as much money, if not more, than what I was getting full time at 3CS at the ACE network. So I could still do that and find other things in Melbourne maybe. Anyway, I was told by Perth that I'd missed out, that Clinton was going to take the job, but Neville's got something for you. So I left 3CS, went back to Melbourne, waited for Neville to call me. He didn't call me. Eventually called him. He said, yeah, call me back on this number. I think I've got something for you. He offered me the job in Darwin. A guy called Dave Lennon was leaving Darwin. But I wasn't that keen on really going up to Darwin. You'd still be out of the mainstream. He said, or you could have the cadetship in Melbourne, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll have a job at the end of it. And I thought, well, I'd like to come back home. spend some time at home, spend some time with my family, with my friends. It'd be a great opportunity. I'll back myself that if I get a chance to call some footy and get a chance to do some elite sport, that I'll be okay, that I can find something at the end of the 12 months and it could still be in Melbourne. So I elected to go to Melbourne and I went to the training. We had 3 weeks training with Peter Newlands, Prue Clark, who's a very successful journalist at the ABC, Chris Taylor, who started off as a journalist and then, of course, became part of the Chaser crew. Emma Griffiths was a foreign correspondent. John Taylor was a foreign correspondent. Airlie Ward, a good newsreader down in Tasmania. They were some of the people that were part of that crew of 1997. We had Kerry O'Brien come and speak to us. You heard some of the stuff we did. I did an interview with John Rebo, who was taking over the Super League in 1997. I remember that year of the Super League before it resorted back to the NRL or the Australian Rugby League in 1998, or it might have been the second year of the Super League. So I interviewed him and I thought it was a typical grandstand interview. And he said, "Oh, you're a bit soft, son. You got a lot of work to do." And then he heard my some of my reads from Fox, which are very laid back. He said, "Jesus, son, you're going to have to temper your sound a bit. You're going to have to sound a little bit more authoritative." And look, it was good advice. I was a little bit shattered because I always found criticism hard, even though I think from the great Kerry O'Brien, he was trying to provide some constructive criticism. But we sat in Mike Carlton's program. He did drive at the time. We learned a lot. Peter Newlands and I went out. The ABC were covering the golf, one of the big Australian Opens out in the North Shore, the northern suburbs of Sydney. It was a fantastic experience. And then we returned to Melbourne and the opportunity to call footy. Peter Booth told me I'd be getting ready for the Bulldogs Fremantle game. You might call that back to Perth. I didn't call brilliantly. I remember at the very end, I reckon my throat was suffering from tension because I was nervous. Winston Abraham took a mark in the square to get Freo over the line against the Dogs. And Glenn Mitchell said to me later on, "Gee, Daniel, you were a bit biased." And I said, "I didn't mean to be, Glenn." And then Peter and I felt I wasn't quite ready. And so I practiced a few matches and then I did some games on Saturday night, 4 in a row. And they said, "Yeah, you're right now." And they were the days when there weren't as many matches in Melbourne on a Saturday night. And they're all mainly out at Waverley.
Waverley games.
Not many at all. Not many at all, maybe 7 or 8. And I called most of them in the first half of the year. And we called it Waverley. And Waverley was an interesting place to call because you called low in the radio boxes. And it was almost like there was a hill over the back at the, I think, the police road end. And you'd think that the ball was out of bounds and a player had come with the ball. "Oh, that's out of bounds." "Oh, no, it's not. Here comes Treleaven of Hawthorn." There seems to be a bit of a hill over that side as you get used to calling here at Waverley. So that was a great experience, but a great challenge. And then I remember round 10, I called 2 games with Dwayne Russell and I thought I really belonged. We called a game back for Perth, I think, North Melbourne and West Coast out at Princes Park. And then we called Richmond and Melbourne. It was Greg Hutchison's first game since taking over from Neil Baum, called with the great Peter Knights. And I thought after that, yeah, I feel like I belong now. It was a wonderful experience. And in the second half of the year, I did mainly producing because Tracy Parish went off and had a baby. And that was a great experience as well, working with Tim, learning to make sure you got the interviews right, that you had the people on time for him, keeping up to the standards that he required because he was such a great broadcaster. And you were basically at his whim and call, if you like, for want of a better expression. And you couldn't buy that experience. And then I called a final with him, part of the 1997 finals when North Melbourne played Geelong on a Sunday night when, of course, they had to move the finals around. For some strange reason, they didn't play a final Friday night, Damo. They had one Saturday afternoon, Dogs in Sydney, and the Dogs won easily. Didn't have one Saturday night because of the Princess Di's funeral. And then had 3 on Sunday. I think the game was starting. People in the West were eating their breakfast when they were watching the footy starting at about 11 o'clock in the morning over in South Australia. And between Adelaide and the Eagles. And then it was Brisbane and St Kilda and then North and Geelong. So I don't know why they didn't have a Friday night game, but I called one final. And to do that and get through it, calling with Ray Walker and Justin Madden and Tim Lane, I thought to myself, I'm still a bit quick. I've got to get more pausation in. But I felt that I was heading in the right direction. And it was a bonus calling all the games I did. I thought at the start I got a long way to go. I thought at the end I still had a long way to go, but it was a great start and great experience to work with Tim and Peter, and Greg Miles was my mentor, and Crackers and Neil Baum and all these wonderful people who were heroes of mine growing up. It was fantastic.
Just lastly, before we wrap up part one, because I know you go to Perth after 1997, and that'll kick off part two of our podcast. But you mentioned Tim Lane. What was he like to work with? Was he intimidating in the early days?
Very intimidating. I was never sure Tim thought I was a great broadcaster, but I think he knew that I worked hard to try and get better at my craft. I knew how good a broadcaster he was, and I was always nervous around him. I was certainly nervous when I called that game with him. I called another game, the last quarter of a game. Dwayne and Peter had called the main game in Sydney, and then we called the last quarter of I think, an Essendon Geelong game, and I got to play it wrong, and I was angry at myself. And I think Tim and Crackers looked at each other, and I did apologise. But I was always worried about not getting it right around him and making sure that I performed well. He was one of these guys that was a perfectionist. You'd stay away from him in the lead up to a broadcast if you were near him on game day, which I was in my second stint at the ABC. I called a few games with him on Saturday afternoon in 2001 and 2002 when Dwayne was unavailable. And that was a great experience, but you wouldn't talk to him much in the lead up because he was trying to get his pre-match right, making sure that was in order. And speaking to, obviously, the journalists, which in 2001 was Caroline Wilson, and 2002, and in 1997 was Patrick Smith, the late Patrick Smith. And he was trying to get the topics right, understand what he was doing. And when I was his producer, I knew after the first couple of times when he'd fire up at you, stay away, Dan. If you've got any questions, get to him earlier in the day. I'd ring him at home and say, I've got a question. Do you mind? At 10:30 before he was heading off, or when he'd get to the ground, he'd ring me back. So I just wanted to make sure, because I rated him so highly, I just wanted to make sure that I did the right thing, that I made sure I performed to the best of my ability. I was okay with the equipment. So if he did any interviews, I'd help him out with that. And same with Peter, who was a great help to me and it made me feel very welcome right from the word go. But you're right. I mean, these are heroes of mine, Damo. These are heroes of mine that I've listened to growing up. And I'm getting an opportunity to work with them. And I know people will say at the end of the day, Dan, they're just like normal blokes like you. They do the same things as you. They've got the same, with the greatest respect, bodily functions as you. They eat like you. They have a drink like you. But they're also heroes in an industry that I love, that I'm now working in. And whether I needed to behave a bit differently, I probably did a bit, but I tried to be myself. And I think Tim and I got on pretty well. And I know in 2001 he backed Francis Leach to get the job and that's well known, when Clinton went across to 3AW, and I made the decision to come back to Melbourne. My dad was very ill. Obviously, we'll chat about that in part two, but he backed Francis, and I knew that I had some work to do to prove to him that I was a good broadcaster. And I think I did that over the years. But look, he was a great man to work with, because he wanted excellence the whole time. And when you were with him, he made you better. And even though it was up to you to make yourself better, it helped working with someone like him to try and reach the high standards.
We'll talk more about Tim in part two, because as you mentioned, you called with him later on. Peter Booth was towards the back end of his career as we reached this era of the late 90s, Dan. And I'll finish off with him because quite often I hear from a lot of people who worked in that era that Peter, Move as he was called, was very, very supportive of young people. As you said, he was a great mentor to Clinton Grimes, really made him in the early days, and was usually pretty supportive of young people. Was that the experience you had with him? And do you think there's enough of that type of mentorship to younger people these days, in terms of giving honest feedback, in terms of, picking a person up mentally as well, that duality? What was Smooth like?
Oh, he was sensational to me. I think he was a bit unsure about my ability, whether I'd make it. But when the decision was made that I was coming to Melbourne, and Clinton had accepted the job to go to Perth, and I think that was the right move for Clinton too, because he was, I think, past the cadetship stage already. And it was an opportunity for him to go to Perth. He was in the system then permanently. He didn't have to worry about what the next 12 months would bring. They would have found a job for him anyway. Probably would have been where he eventually went, which was into TV sport when Peter G made the decision to replace Ali, who'd been reading the news in Perth and in Tassie and wasn't comfortable. And Peter went down there to Hobart, and that's why Clinton came back from Perth and I went to Perth. But Peter, once I got the job, and he rang me and said, welcome. The first day I was there with Greg, and I went to a stall gift launch, and Greg helped me work through decarp, which was pretty hard for me first day. And then the next day there was a cricket match on, and I went down and sat with him, and he did updates on the hour for the newsroom, WA and Victoria, and he said, I think you're ready to do the next day, which it didn't quite get to the next day because WA won easily. But we chatted a lot, and he gave me a lot of advice, and he knew that I was working pretty hard and trying to get better. And after I did that first game between the Dogs and Fremantle, and I went and practiced in a spare box, which are always a lot more spare boxes in those days. The next couple of rounds before round 4, he'd listen and would go over and he'd give you good advice, and he knew I was trying hard and trying to improve. And then he said, round 4, you think you're ready? I said, yep, I'm ready. And he backed me, and then from then on, he just said, you know, which game you're doing? And that was great. And he's the right person to certainly help young people. He was the right person at the time. So good to help young people. And I don't think that there are enough people doing it. I've certainly been willing to help. When I worked at Swinburne for a while doing some teaching, there just weren't enough people interested in broadcasting sport. They're more interested in being reporters. And that's fine. And that's why that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't do that at Swinburne. But I was always willing to offer support. I've always been a big believer that you don't be negative, that you always come up with a way of how they can improve. You always say, well, there are areas to work on, but I like what you did there. I like what you did there. I think that's great. That's your strength at the moment. This will come. We'll work on that. I think when you speak to young people, and Peter was very good at this. Wally Foreman in Perth was very good at this. And we'll talk about this in part 2. I loved him. He was a great mentor of mine, Wally Foreman over in Perth. When you are speaking to young people, particularly in an industry like ours, Damian, you've got to make them feel better after you've spoken to them. They may feel as flat as a tack, thinking, oh, someone's going to have a crack at my broadcasting. What you're trying to do is you're trying to make them better. You're not saying that was hopeless. Okay, we know it's hopeless. Why was it hopeless? I'm still new to this. Show me how I can improve. And that's what you need, and that's what Peter was able to do, and that's what we need more of nowadays. I don't think we have enough of it. But having said that, I think Generation X, and you and I discussed it on our cricket podcast on the recent test series between India and Australia for KISS Professional Solutions. Good on you to John McEncroe for jumping on board. The Generation X are very, very confident. That's Sam Constas. And I think nowadays you try and talk to Generation X and you try and talk to new broadcasters, which I have in my role at Gameface. But they're looking ahead, or when am I ready to go and work for Fox Footy or work for the ABC or work for 3AW? It's still a long way away. I mean, it does take a bit of time. And that's why, as going back to what we discussed earlier, it's good that we've got all these leagues, suburban leagues, that have got streaming processes in place to call their games, because you give people an opportunity to learn. At the end of the day, I know AFL is where you want to be and it might be a bit quicker, but you're still learning a lot by broadcasting these pretty good leagues, and you're only going to get better, and you need to have people who are in your corner who are helping you become better and making you continue and making you feel confident within yourself. If you're not feeling confident within yourself, and again, we've spoken about that earlier, I don't think you can reach the level that you'd like to reach and the level that you should be able to reach.
Well, Dan, we'll touch on your time in Perth, which comes up towards the back end of the 1990s, and then you head back to Melbourne as a full-time sports broadcaster and really establish yourself as a big name in the sporting media, particularly when it comes to commentary in various respects, not only with AFL, but a variety of sports as well, and the Olympics as well. Looking forward to that in part number 2. Tune in for that on Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures.
Thanks, Dame. I hope people don't fall asleep with my answers. Loved every minute of it, Dame.